What's up, Space Monkeys? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden. Today we're going to be reading Dreamland, chapters 4 through 6. We're going to learn a little bit about Dr. David Proctor and the start of OxyContin and how it started getting prescribed so often and very willy-nilly, if I might add. And then we're going to learn a little bit more about Enrique, who is from the first chapter of the book, and he's smuggling black tar heroin. In tiny South Shore, Kentucky, huddled next to the Ohio River, Biggs Lane amounts to a rural strip mall. For its entire 100 yards, Biggs Lane hugs Route 23. Wright Pharmacy has been on Biggs a long time. Near Wright's is a dentist's office and a chiropractor, a gas station and a Subway sandwich shop. Farther down is a flooring shop. Next to that stands a good-sized beige metal-framed building. To the south of Biggs is a street named Tootsie Drive and a neighborhood of small white wood houses that would be called quiet, except for that would be redundant. Everything in South Shore, Kentucky, population 2,100, is quiet, including the majestic Ohio River 100 yards north. Across the river is Portsmouth, Ohio, wedged onto land where the Scioto River angles into the Ohio. In Portsmouth and South Shore is where another part of our story begins. In 1979, the same year that Herschel Jick up in Boston wrote his letter to the New England Journal of Medicine, a doctor named David Proctor moved into that beige metal-framed building on Biggs Lane in South Shore and called his new clinic Plaza Healthcare. Proctor had come to South Shore at the behest of Billy Riddle, the town's family doc. Billy Riddle had been in South Shore for years. He delivered many of the kids in town and treated every ailment as best he could. He had trouble turning down patients and needed help. Somehow he found Proctor, a Canadian who just completed an internship in Nova Scotia, and enticed him to South Shore in 1977. But within 2 years, Riddle had separated his practice from Proctor's and changed the locks on his doors. Not long after that, in 1979, Billy Riddle died of a heart attack, and then only David Proctor remained. Proctor was a talkative and easygoing fellow, but he was flashy in a way foreign to the Ohio River Valley. He wore diamond rings. He wore fur jackets. He drove a Porsche. Quote, "He dressed like Little Richard or something, or Liberace," said one nurse. Portsmouth is an industrial town in the rural heartland, an outpost on the Ohio River far from other towns. In their glory days, river towns were places for rambunctious men to explode after days of cooped up on barges. Portsmouth once felt it necessary to outlaw swimming naked in the river. Back then, 7 shoe factories and the country's largest shoelace manufacturer were in downtown Portsmouth. A brickyard, a foundry, and the massive Detroit Steel Company attracted people from Ohio and Kentucky and employed thousands. Detroit Steel made bombs during World War II. Hundreds of people attended the inauguration of its new blast furnace in 1953, marveling at its size and happy with the jobs it would provide. Meanwhile, railroads took Portsmouth's steel and shoes to the rest of the country. For years, sons took jobs at the factories where their fathers worked, and, like a Bruce Springsteen song, that's how life went. The town was a cradle of professional football. Jim Thorpe coached the Portsmouth Shoe Steels. Later, the Portsmouth Spartans joined the National Football League. The Spartans moved to Detroit during the Great Depression and became the Detroit Lions. Some say Portsmouth's long trip down began with the flood of 1937, when the Ohio River rose 74 feet after 40 days of rain. What is true is that by the 1970s, Portsmouth was collapsing, along with the rest of what was becoming the American Rust Belt, a region unprepared for globalization, competition, and the cheaper labor in countries like Mexico. The shoe factories began closing. Selby Shoes was long gone. Williams Shoes hung on longer, trying to compete with Italy and Taiwan and Mexico, but soon Williams left too, and the factory's empty shells remained as reminders of what had been. Detroit Steel departed in 1980, the year Portsmouth was named an All-American City for the second time. Thousands of jobs went with it. The city didn't recover from that. The brickyard closed too. So did the atomic energy plant up in Piketon. The Coke plant that supplied Detroit Steel meanwhile closed in stages and finally gave up in 2000. A Walmart replaced them both. Near the retailer still stands the Coke plant's smokestack. Families fled to Columbus or Cincinnati or Nashville. A group of artists moved to Austin, Texas. Portsmouth's population deflated to 20,000. Unsellable houses were rented out or stood empty after landlords moved away. Stores in Chillicothe Street closed one by one until there wasn't much left there at all. Remaining behind was a thin slice of educated people. They found work in the schools or the hospitals, in some way or other tending to those for whom factory closings were the beginning of an American nightmare. About the only new folks who came to Portsmouth then were merchants of the poor economy. Portsmouth got its first check-cashing places and its first rent-owns. Pawn shops and scrap metal yards opened, and David Proctor expanded his practice. Many swore by Proctor. Hard work was part of life in the area, and by then so was unemployment. The region slumped, and the numbers of people applying for disability or workers' comp shot up. Federal disability became long-term unemployment insurance for many in the Ohio River Valley. Some were legitimately hurt or disabled, some weren't, but they all needed a doctor's diagnosis. Proctor processed workers' comp paperwork fast. At Portsmouth's small Southern Hills Hospital, where Proctor had privileges, nurses remembered him as the top admitter to the psych ward, mostly in an attempt to make patients eligible for disability. Proctor was married with 2 sons living in Kentucky. He was also a flirt, and the staff saw him out in the parking lot at times in a lover's quarrel with nurses. At Southern Hills, Proctor ran through his rounds, literally ran. He was at high speed, animated. A new attitude was taking hold in American medicine at the time. The patient, it held, was always right, particularly when it came to pain. The doctor was to believe a patient who said he was in pain. David Proctor embodied this new attitude, and then some. He had a folksy style with a little of an evangelist in him. His patients loved him because he had the ability to figure out what that person believed or needed or wanted, said Lisa Roberts, who was a hospital nurse at the time. He was brilliant in that way, to forensically identify vulnerable people and figure out what they needed or believed. He would tell them they had all these things wrong with them. Proctor was paid in cash at his South Shore clinic. In the mid-1980s, the medical world wrestled with how to use the new opiates that pharmaceutical companies were developing to treat pain. David Proctor was an early and aggressive adopter. He prescribed opiates for neck, leg, and lower back pain, arthritis, and lower lumbar spine pain. He combined them with benzodiazepines, anxiety relievers, of which Valium and Xanax were Proctor's favorites, are best known. In Portsmouth, people had anxiety and they had pain. Appalachia had a long history of using benzodiazepines, dating to the release of Valium in the early 60s. Little old ladies used it. In this part of the country, anything that relieved pain was welcome. But opiates and benzos together also led quickly to addiction. By the mid-1990s, Proctor was also known to prescribe a lot of diet pills and stimulants, even to those who weren't fat. A modest industry evolved in and around Portsmouth of scamming prescriptions for diet pills from willing docs like Proctor, then selling the pills for a profit. His Plaza Healthcare clinic boomed. In 1996, one who went to visit him was a man named Randy, a guard at the state prison in Lucasville, 10 miles north of Portsmouth. Randy suffered deep bruises in his back in a fight with an inmate. He was given a list of approved doctors to see. One was David Proctor. Several guys from the prison went there because his office could take care of workers' comp paperwork, Randy remembered. Proctor took him off work for 6 months and sure enough handled all the paperwork, charging him $200 cash. He also prescribed a drug called OxyContin, 40 milligrams twice a day for 30 days. The drug was a new painkiller, he said, and they were having good results with it. Looking back on it, the injury was nothing that warranted that harsh of a drug, Randy recalled. But at the time, you're thinking, this is great because I don't feel my back. 30 days later, Randy figured he was better and didn't return to Proctor for a refill. Soon he was gripped by what he thought was the worst flu of his life. He ached, he couldn't get out of bed, he had diarrhea, and was throwing up. He talked with some friends. One suggested he might be going through withdrawal. Then it hit him. You've got to go back. Proctor prescribed him more of the same. Randy returned every month, paying $200 cash for a 3-minute visit with Proctor and an Oxy prescription. Proctor's waiting room overflowed. People fought over space in line. Only a handful of patients were there for injuries. The rest were feigning pain, scamming prescriptions with the doctor's connivance. Randy saw 6 fellow prison guards in the waiting room. He kept his head down, got his oxy prescription, and left. "You're seeing people who you know are probably going to be locked up in one of your cell blocks," he said. "It really humbles you. You think you're doing stuff the way it's supposed to be done. You're trusting the doctor. After a while, you realize this isn't right, but there really isn't anything you can do about it. You're stuck. You're addicted." Before long, he found street dealers he could go to if he ran out during the month. He returned to his prison job, but by then fully addicted to an opiate. He began arriving late and making excuses. Desperate, he finally went to a deputy warden. He got into treatment and got clean. 3.5 years after going to David Proctor the first time, the addiction was over for Randy. For the Ohio River Valley in America, it was just beginning. The Ad Man, New York, New York. In 1951, an ad man named Arthur Sackler from a little-known marketing firm met with the sales director of a small 100-year-old chemical concern named Charles Pfizer and Company in New York City. Pfizer. Where does that name ring a bell? Arthur Mitchell Sackler was 39 and already had a career of achievement as a psychiatrist behind him. He and his brothers, Raymond and Mortimer, God, Jesus, Arthur, Raymond, and Mortimer, you could just tell that they were going to grow up to be like evil, white, rich guys taking advantage of people's health. He and his brothers, Raymond and Mortimer, had grown up in New York, the sons of Eastern European Jewish immigrants. They attended college during the Depression, and all three passed briefly through the Communist Party, according to Alan Wald, the author of American Night, the literary left in the era of the Cold War. Arthur Sackler began his publishing career on his high school newspaper. During the Depression, he printed single-handedly what Wald called, quote-unquote, crude strike bulletins for the Communist Party. Sackler took art classes at night and paid for his schooling with odd jobs. Finishing his medical studies, Sackler became a psychiatrist at Creedmoor, a New York mental hospital. There he wrote more than 150 papers on psychiatry and experimental medicine, and identified some of the chemical causes of schizophrenia and manic depression. He was an anti-smoking crusader long before it was popular, and prohibited smoking at the companies he would later own. At Long Island University, he started laboratories for therapeutic research, which he later directed and supported with large donations. Meanwhile, he established the first racially integrated blood bank in New York City. Sackler watched medicine change radically during the post-war years. Scientific advances were allowing companies to produce life-altering drugs, antibiotics and vaccines in particular. It was an effervescent time, though less so for medical advertising, which remained plodding and gray, even as the new drugs it promoted were changing the world. Sackler saw no reason this should be. He switched careers in the 1940s and was hired on at William Douglas McAdams, a small, rather staid medical advertising firm. Before long, one of his clients was Charles Pfizer and Company, and the world's largest manufacturer of vitamin C. The company's newly formed pharmaceutical research department had developed a synthetic antibiotic, first derived from soil bacteria, that it called terramycin, and that had proven effective on more than 50 diseases, including pneumonia. The company was moving from chemical manufacturing to pharmaceuticals. Instead of licensing it to a drug company, Pfizer wanted to sell the antibiotic itself. In the office that day, Sackler told the company's sales director, Thomas Wynn, that with a large enough advertising budget for terramycin, he could turn Charles Pfizer and Company into a household name among doctors. Ah! That's where we've heard the name Pfizer before. Wynn gave him a budget larger than any company had ever spent to advertise a drug. Sackler plastered the media with what would be called now a teaser campaign, said John Collier, a copywriter at William Douglas McAdams at the time. The terramycin campaign aimed at frequent contact with individual doctors, a radical new concept. Sackler put large color ads in medical journals with plays on the word terra, Italian for earth, terra bona, and some others. When the drug was finally released in America, he placed ads in the same font and color saying terramycin. Meanwhile, Sackler's ad writers in New York wrote thousands of postcards meant to appear as if they were from Egypt, Australia, Malta, and elsewhere. They mailed these cards, addressed individually to thousands of U.S. family doctors, pediatricians, and surgeons, describing how terramycin was combating diseases in these exotic locales. Quote, milk fever in Malta, Q fever in Australia. The cards were signed, Sincerely Pfizer. Doctors already known to prescribe a lot of drugs got extra direct mail. Of course they did. Then Sackler sent salesmen on visits to doctors' offices. Quote, they were intensive drives, Collier said. At the same time, we had a very heavy schedule of direct mailings, several mailings at a time to these doctors, along with journal ads. Collier remembered that Sackler paid to have a, quote, Pfizer Spectrum, an 8-page glossy house organ inserted into the monthly Journal of the American Medical Association for a year. All that combined with the drug's efficacy to make terramycin a blockbuster, with $45 million in sales in 1952. Based on its terramycin success, Charles Pfizer and Company expanded to 13 countries and eventually changed its name to Pfizer. Sackler's campaign marked the emergence of modern pharmaceutical advertising, a field that up until then, in the words of one executive, quote, existed, but it didn't. Seeing the future, Sackler bought the firm he worked for, William Douglas McAdams. As an aside, he and his brothers also purchased an unknown drug company, Purdue Frederick, formed in the 1890s during the days of patent medicines by John Purdue Gray and George Frederick Bingham. The company had limped along since then, and until our story begins to unfold in the 1980s, it was still known mainly for selling antiseptics, a laxative, and an earwax remover. Arthur Sackler, meanwhile, continued to transform drug marketing. In 1963, he licensed from Hoffa LaRoche the right to import and sell a new tranquilizer called Valium. Sackler again emphasized direct doctor contact to promote the drug. Detail men, or salesmen, frequently visited doctors' offices bearing free samples of Valium. He put booths at medical conventions and frequent multi-page color ads in medical journals. He published another glossy monthly magazine with stories about what well-known doctors were up to, along with other news and Valium ads. Welcome to America, holy shit. Part of the campaign aimed to convince doctors to prescribe Valium, which the public saw as dangerous. Ads urged doctors to view a patient's physical pain as connected to stress, with Valium as the de-stressor. If a child was sick, maybe her mother was tense. Valium was marketed above all to women, pitched as a way of bearing the stress of lives as wives and mothers. Before the feminist movement, women were presumed to need that kind of help for the rest of their lives, thus there was no worry then about its addictiveness. Among Arthur Sackler's many talents was that he thought like a family practitioner. Docs were barraged with patients who were tense and worried. The patient would walk in, and I'm nervous all day long, doctor, or my son's in the army, said Win Gerson, who worked for Sackler for the years and later became president of William Douglas McAdams. Quote, people were walking around nervous, worried, and this drug absolutely calmed them. It worked for certain types of back pains. It kind of made junkies out of some people, but that drug worked. Yet if terramycin was an unmitigated benefit to humankind, Valium was less so, or rather, any benefits were offset by significant risks. There was a little of 19th century patent medicine in Valium's DNA. It didn't treat any root causes of stress. Instead, it treated vague symptoms and thus allowed doctors to avoid the complicated work of understanding the causes of that stress. Like patent medications, Valium was a name-brand drug, promoted together with the idea that a pill could solve any ailment. 4 decades later, and well after Arthur Sackler was gone, his company, Purdue, would produce and promote, through his ad firm William Douglas McAdams, a painkiller with similar characteristics. Valium became the pharmaceutical industry's first $100 million drug, and then its first billion-dollar drug. By the mid-70s, Valium was found indeed to be addictive, and a street trade grew up around it. Hoffman LaRoche was accused of not warning of the drug's addictive potential. Sackler, meanwhile, kept combining remarkable energy with great intellectual curiosity. He founded the Medical Tribune, a bi-weekly newspaper full of ads from the now burgeoning pharmaceutical industry. In the newspaper, he wrote a column, One Man in Medicine. He became a world-class collector of Chinese art, and at parties at his house, guests hobnobbed with Luciano Pavarotti and Isaac Stern. As doctors raced to keep up with rapidly changing medicine, Sackler saw another marketing opportunity. He pushed his drug company clients to fund CME, continuing medical education, seminars that were increasingly required for doctors to keep their licenses. By funding CME seminars, he saw, drug companies could grab the ears of physicians. Arthur Sackler never retired. In 1987, at age 73, he had a heart attack and died. He left behind a wife and 2 ex-wives, a spectacular fortune, and an industry so indebted that it referred to him by his first name. Today, his name is on galleries or wings of the Smithsonian Institution, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, the Royal Academy in London, as well as at Princeton, Harvard, Beijing universities. Medical facilities bear his name at Tel Aviv, Tufts, and New York universities. In 1996, he was one of the 5 first inductees into the Medical Advertising Hall of Fame. Why is that a fucking thing? The Medical Advertising Hall of Fame? Stranger than fiction. But Arthur Sackler is important to this story because he founded modern pharmaceutical advertising, and in the words of John Collier, showed the industry, quote, that amazing things can be achieved with direct selling and intensive direct advertising. Years later, Purdue would put those strategies to use marketing its new opiate painkiller, OxyContin. Enrique begins. A rancho in Nayarit, Mexico. Enrique's mother hated rain. It dripped through the corrugated tin roof of their cardboard shack, keeping them damp for weeks. She placed pans and buckets around the shack to catch the new streams of water finding their way through the roof. As a toddler, Enrique ran about in the rain, splashed in puddles, and chased after the town's stray dogs. But to his mother, cold and relentless rain embodied their poverty and reminded her of her husband. Enrique's parents lived at the bottom of a rancho, with no paved streets or electricity, in the Mexican state of Nayarit. His parents had married young and without land. They eked a living from selling charcoal and wood. Enrique was their second child. The family was wedged into a 4-room house with 2 other families. A few years later, they found land in a barrio known as the Toad, near a bog at the village bottoms. They crafted that 2-room shack from cardboard, tarp, and plywood that could be scavenged from garbage dumps. They had more children. Enrique remembers nothing from those years but yelling, and his father beating his mother, and his mother having no idea where each day's food was coming from. Then a miracle. Enrique's father inherited all 50 acres owned by his parents, who had decided not to share any of it with their other children. With that, Enrique's father became a landowner and grew sugarcane, which, this being Mexico's populous 1970s, enjoyed new government price supports. With savings, he bought an old sugarcane truck. Property didn't often soften Enrique's father. It inflated him with arrogance. Coming home drunk at night, he yelled at his kids and beat his wife more often. He spoke no words that weren't orders. When Enrique's mother asked her husband for money to run the household, he gave it with insults. His truck roared like a beast, and he rode around the village high in the seat, as if it were a fine mare. One morning, when Enrique was 8, he was helping his father, who was hungover and working under the truck. His father called for his son to find him a tool. Enrique had no idea what the tool was. Under the truck, his father grew angry. Enrique spun about, searching without knowing what he was looking for. His father cursed him. Enrique began to cry in desperation. His father crawled out from under the truck. Enrique ran off. His father chased him down and beat him. Enrique had never beaten an animal the way he was beaten that day. He cried himself to sleep that night, angry that his mother hadn't defended him, hating life and hating his father. He heard people say they were happy in their poverty, but Enrique never knew anybody poor who was anything but miserable. An unbridgeable river seemed to separate the Toad from the world. In the Toad, poverty pitted villagers against each other in a vicious battle for an upper hand. Enrique milked cows for another farmer. He was paid 2 liters of milk a day and 10 pesos a week, and with it endured the kicks and the insults from the father's son, who was his age. Once, when Enrique was sick, his mother took him to a hospital in Tepech. He stared at perfumed women and men in new cars and children with new clothes. The city was only a few miles from his rancho, but it seemed a distant land on the other side of that river. Enrique grew older and went to school. There he learned to hate his teachers like his mother hated rain. They treated kids from the village's upper barrio with respect, but spoke sharply to the ragged children who came up from the Toad without food for lunch. To the upper barrio kids, the teachers awarded prizes of candy and toys that no one from the Toad had a chance of winning. Some teachers forbade the Toad kids from going to the bathroom until they wet themselves. A few teachers showed up drunk. Others didn't show up for weeks at a time. Enrique's father mocked him for not knowing his multiplication tables, but how could he know them with teachers like these? Life held one thrill. His mother's brothers were up in L.A. working, which gave his family a connection that other kids envied. Villagers spoke of his uncles like far-off explorers and traded their latest news. Enrique didn't let on to his friends that his father never got along with these uncles. There had been a fight years before in which his father had been knifed and 2 people on his uncle's side of the family died. His father married into the family, but he and his brothers-in-law never liked each other. Then one day, news spread that an uncle was returning from the San Fernando Valley. Relatives thrilled at the gifts that he would bring. That day, mothers washed their kids and lined them up in anticipation. The uncle, remembering the feud with Enrique's father, had gifts for everyone but Enrique, his sisters, and his mother. The children went home in tears of incomprehension. Life improved only slowly. Somehow his mother saved enough to buy a cow, and finally they were ranchers of a sort, and worked harder because of it. Enrique went to bed dreaming of life as a respected ranchero. For a while he thought he glimpsed a future as a cop. Highway patrolman looked like an exciting job. But his father had no political connections to get him into the academy. Besides, said his father, I need an agronomist, not a patrolman. Remember, one day this land will be yours. Your sisters will get married and go live with their husbands. You'll inherit the land and the house. Enrique's father held that promise over him, and soon it seemed more like a threat. Enrique saw farmers like his father draining their lives into these fields. They remained the same ignorant, violent, cold men stuck in poverty, controlled by others. Escaping this fate became Enrique's greatest concern. His urgency intensified when he spotted a girl. She was 12 and beautiful. Her father was a butcher in town. That placed her in the upper classes of the rancho, while above Enrique's station as the son of an alcoholic sugarcane farmer. She lived up on the hill, which was more than just geographically above the Toad. The kids from that barrio had parents who owned stores, slightly better houses, and more land. They ruled the town playground and ran off kids from the Toad with rocks. Enrique knew he could give this girl none of the life that she and her father expected for her. But when he asked her to be his girlfriend, she accepted. Theirs was a chaste village romance, filled with kisses and hugs. For it to become more than that, Enrique knew he would have to get moving. Then his mother went to California for a few months. She returned with gifts, but also with the news that one of her brothers had been killed by a police officer overstepping his authority, she said. People in the village accepted that story. His remaining uncles up north, whose anger at Enrique's mother for having married his father had subsided, sent Enrique his first clothes from America. Villagers viewed these men as heroes. Some asked his uncles for help getting north. Enrique imagined his uncles were grand men in a place called Canoga Park. His mother found work overseeing the village's school lunch program, so Enrique no longer went hungry at school. His father was elected treasurer of the local sugarcane farmers cooperative. He oversaw the installation of the first village streetlights. It surprised Enrique to see his father so diligent about putting in village light poles while he brought so much darkness home. Then junior high ended. Enrique attempted high school in Tepech. He spent 2 weeks there, each day without anything to eat for lunch, before he ran out of bus money and withdrew. The threat of a life in the fields now seemed frighteningly real. Toiling in the cane would never allow him to give his girl what she and her father expected for her. In the village, girls married young. Though she was only 13, Enrique had no time to lose. Plumbing was at least coming to the village. Now townsfolk could get drinking water from the faucet instead of from distant wells. Toilets would replace the hills. But Enrique thought only of his uncles in Canoga Park, so he made plans and he kept them to himself. He'd get to Tijuana, find a coyote to take him to Canoga Park. He had no address or phone number for his uncles, but surely they were so well known that they'd be easy to find. One day he walked through the village, greeted his friends, spent time with his girlfriend, and said farewell to no one. The next, he took a birth certificate and put on his best black jacket, one that his uncles had sent to him, a white-collared shirt and blue pants, kissed his mother, and said he'd be back later that day. He went to Tepic and boarded Tres Estrellas de Oro, the low-cost bus line that over the years took people by the hundreds of thousands north intending to cross. He paid for the ticket with 200 pesos he had swiped from his parents. He considered the money a loan, so he wouldn't feel bad for taking it. He sat by the window for 28 hours, so he could see all the things that he had never seen before. It was 1989 and he was 14. Next chapter is called The Molecule. Hope you guys are enjoying the book. Sorry about that at the end there. My cat is bothering me right now. You can't see her, but she's meowing at me. So I hope it didn't interrupt too much. Talk to you guys later.